pressing something.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Gary, as always, for starting recording. So we were looking at, actually, before I start, just to remind everyone, this will be the last share on the sugya of Koreah. Our learning time will come to an end, I think this Tuesday, Adam, is that right?
Yeah, Tuesday's the last session, we said, yeah.
So, what I would say is we have an Agada sugya that is coming up. I'll try and give some general sources on Agada, but I won't be able to give sources in detail. Use the break also to do chazara from really the Mishnah on Ein Gimel Amud Aleph all the way through. Those who have been in the show all the way through, we've learned now, have learned all the way through. Those who joined later, we missed out on Ein Daled Amud Aleph, but the shiurim are available. I'm happy to give them to anyone who missed those shiurim, and you can use them also for the break. In general, I have all the recordings saved, even from the pre-Zoom world, so you don't get to see a recording of my face speaking, but you can still hear the audio. So I'm happy to give that to anyone who wants to use the break for Chazara. And then after Pesach, we'll start with the sugya that follows. More information to follow. Okay.
No share on Tuesday.
There won't be a share on Tuesday. There will not be a share on Tuesday. Koreah on the Masechet. So we were discussing the concept of the share of shtei tefillos. We looked at the share, the measure of two tefillos, of two stitches, in the context of tofer, of sewing, and we discussed whether it's a normal share, a normal quantity, where it's quantitative. If you eat half a gzais, you've eaten half of the gzais. It's just not enough to make you chayiv, but there would be the concept of chatzi share. Or is it different? Is it qualitative? That unless you stitch two stitches, where it goes through twice, it isn't sewing at all. It isn't a significant join at all, and therefore it's not tofer at all. That was in the context of tofer. We then looked at Koreah and how to apply this to Koreah. The Mishnah says Koreah manas litva shtei tefillos, and we saw the Rambam, who, as pointed out by Rabbi Zobin, who says that there's two conditions over here. I'm guessing a bit of buzzing coming through, so can I just ask everyone to mute themselves who isn't muted? Sorry, a bit of interference coming through. Who says that there's two elements of shtei tefillos. The Rambam Perek Yod Halacha Yud says Hakodeya Kodei Litva shtei tefillos Almanas Litva shtei tefillos. You have to tear a measure enough of two tefillos in order to sew shtei tefillos. So you have to tear a certain quantity shtei tefillos with the intention of sewing shtei tefillos. Now the second condition that you need to have the intention to sew two tefillos is intuitive. If the melachot of Koreah has to be almanas, then I understand why you need two stitches. But if the melachot is, that's why you need to be able to re-sew two stitches. But why do I also have to tear two stitch worths? For example, we could imagine a scenario where I tear one stitch worths, and that allows me to sew two stitch worths in its place. So why should there be a need to tear two stitch worths? Evidently, this is a shear, not just in tofer, but also in Koreah in an oven itself. That Koreah also has this shear of shtei tefillos. So goes Rabbi Zobin's reading in the Rambam, and we discussed this last week. Now, how does this apply to sewing when it is not, tearing when I'm not tearing in order to re-sew? When I'm only tofer, Koreah for some other reason, like Koreah b'chamaso, someone who is tearing in their anger. So what I'm going to do is lay out a machlokas in this matter, and then argue that I think there's a significant amount of evidence one way. And the machlokas is the Biur Halacha, and I printed this on the source sheets. The Biur Halacha argues that there is no share of shtei tefillos when you're doing a different Koreah. He says that the share of shtei tefillos is where you are doing a Koreah, a tearing, in order to re-sew. However, when you are doing a tearing not in order to re-sew, because the tearing has its own intrinsic and fundamental significance, there would not be a share of shtei tefillos. Now, I want to just unpick the rationale or the chiddush in what the Biur Halacha is saying, because again, no one is arguing that if you tear in order to sew, it has to be in order to sew 2 stitches. Because it's reason, it's svara. If sewing is only a malacha when you sew 2 stitches, then surely tearing, which is only a malacha because it's preparation for sewing, has to be in order to sew 2 stitches. That's not a matter of controversy. But we saw in the Rambam that the Rambam said, it's not enough that you're tearing in order to sew 2 stitches, you have to tear 2 stitch worth in order to sew 2 stitches. Now, if you have to tear 2 stitches worth, that seems to indicate this is a measure of tearing. In which case, what's the logic of the Biur Halacha, who says that when it comes to other tearing, you don't need to tear 2 stitches worth? And the answer is, the logic of the Biur Halacha is that Koreah, which is in order to resew, is a preparatory melachot to toifa. And therefore, not only do you need that you are tearing in order to resew 2 stitches, but you have to tear 2 stitches worth in order for it to be a melacha. Because if toifa is only chashuv when it's tearing 2 stitches worth, then Koreah is only significant when you are ripping 2 stitches worth. So there you have the shear of 2 stitches. However, if you're doing tearing, which isn't a preparation for resewing, then maybe it doesn't need 2 stitches because its chashivas is not in the length of 2 stitches, and therefore it would even be less. So argues the Biur Halacha. And the first piece of evidence for this position is the view of the Rambam, because the Rambam says that when you're Koreah on the Yoris, when you tear papers which are dovuk, which are dovukas, you don't need 2 stitches worth. So this is evidence of the view of the Biur Halacha. Again, is everyone with me here in the distinction between the intentionality of the 2 stitches and the actual act of tearing? The Rambam says there's 2 conditions. You have to be doing it with enough of a tear to resew 2 stitches, but you also have to tear the 2 stitches themselves. The logic being that since it's preparatory for toifa, there's 2 clauses here. It has to be preparatory for toifa, which would be a malacha, i.e. resewing 2 stitches, but the tear itself has to be 2 stitches. Argues the Mishnah Berurah, this is where you're tearing in order to resew, but if you're tearing for some other reason, like Koreah b'chamaso, it wouldn't need this shear. And similarly, if you're Koreah, something like Nioris or Zavukas. The Minchas Chinuch argues, and he says, no, you always need to tear 2 stitches worth, because this is the shear, the measure of the shame Koreah of the amount that you need to tear. And therefore, in the same way as sewing isn't considered a length of sewing that has significance unless it's 2, similarly, unstitching isn't considered a length that is significant unless you have 2. Now, I think that there is considerable evidence, like the view of the Biur Halacha, at least in some of the Rishonim. So maybe this is enough like Rishonim, but I think there are Rishonim from whom it is evident that the Biur Halacha is correct. And the first Rishon I want to share with you is the Tosfos and Lamed Aleph Amud Beis. Now, Tosfos, I'm only going to look at Tosfos outside just in the interest of time, but Tosfos on Lamed Aleph Amud Beis discusses which melachos it says almanas for and which melachos it doesn't. So, for example, soiser, dismantling a building, has to be almanas in order to rebuild, almanas livnos. And similarly, mechaber, extinguishing, has to be almanas lahavi in order to prepare it for a lighting. Nonetheless, the Mishnah doesn't list it. The Mishnah only lists it when it comes to several of the melachos. In our scenario, Koreah almanas litvo and mochik almanas limchok, etc. And Tosfos answers this question by saying that any melachos where, well, Tosfos' words are actually, just someone nod, did I put the Tosfos on the source sheet? Did people see inside or not? Did I add it in afterwards? Yeah, I did. Okay, so you've seen Tosfos inside, so I can read it inside. V'yesh Shlomo says Tosfos, the only reason it says that almanas is because it wants to say the shear of shtei osius, the shtei tefillas and 2 stitches. Al mechaber v'soiser, where there's no shear, it doesn't list the almanas. So Tosfos says something a little difficult to understand. He says that where you have a shear of shtei osius of 2 letters or shtei tefillas, 2 stitches, there it needs to say almanas. However, where you don't have such a shear, it doesn't bother saying almanas. Now, how are we meant to understand this? So either Tosfos just means sort of circumstantially, since there is the shear, it says almanas in order to indicate the shear. Or Tosfos means conceptually, and to me, I think this is a better reading of Tosfos. Tosfos is really making the Biur Halacha's point. When it's an almanas, you need the shear in the act you're doing. So since Koreah is a melacha because it's almanas litzvar, therefore Koreah adopts the shear of Tova and also needs straight tefiras. Where Moichek is almanas lichtov, therefore Moichek erasing adopts the shear of Kasiva, which is 2 letters. However, a melacha which doesn't have a shear, therefore, even a kol shiur therefore it wouldn't be relevant to mention this detail of almanas. Meaning to say that the almanas melacha has the shear because it's an almanas. Why does the Mishnah highlight Koreah almanas litzvar when there are other Koreahs out there? The answer is the other Koreahs out there are just their own melachos. They don't have the shear. But Koreah almanas litzvar, as per the argument of the Biur Halacha, since it adopts the shear of the parent melacha, the melacha that it comes from, and it's a melacha which is a means to an end, rather than in a sense its own melacha. It achieves the status of melacha because it's creative and constructive, because it's preparatory to another melacha. Therefore, it adopts the shear of the parent melacha that it is preparatory to. So I think this is Peshat and Tosfos, and I think this is indicative of the Biur Halacha's style of thinking, which is that it is only a melacha, that the shear only applies when it is an almanas melacha, but not when it isn't an almanas melacha. So this is one piece of evidence, I think, for this way of thinking.
Can I ask, according to the Minchat Chinuch, where it's just the shtei tefirah, it would be the shiur, how would he deal with tefirah al-meto, where you only actually achieve the tikkun by getting to a tefach, which I assume is longer than the length of 2 stitches?
That happens to be the case. Meaning, it is true that if you're Koreah al hameis, you are only chayav if you have done sufficient for Koreah al hameis. But that's only because that happens to be the amount that is necessary for Koreah al hameis. But in principle, you don't need that share of Koreah. So, for example, if we can imagine a thought experiment, this wouldn't be relevant in fact to Halacha because there's doubts about it. But if you're Koreah al hameis just before Shabbos starts, and you do 3/4 of the tear before the start of Shabbos, and then Shabbos starts as you do the last quarter of the tear, the Minchas Chinuch would argue that you are chayev because you have done a significant melacha even without the shear. And there isn't intrinsically a shear. It happens to be that, normally speaking, you need the shear tefach for the melacha. So this seems to me a raya like the. This seems to be indicative of Mishnah Berurah's way of thinking about these things. The second indication, I think, is explicit, and I want to remind you of what we earlier discussed in the Mishnah in Kilayim. And I put on the source sheet a reminder to go back to have a look at the Mishnah in Kilayim. This was a Mishnah in Perek Tes, Mishnah Yud of Kilayim. And I think the viewpoint of the Biur Halacha is absolutely explicit there in the Mishnah. And I didn't have time to go through all the Achronim and Rishonim on this sugya, but I don't think this is that clearly pointed out by the Mefarshim, this diuk, this issue. So the Mishnah in Kilayim, if you remember, says as follows: Hatokiv tekifa achas ein chibur. So it's talking about sharpness, which is Kilayim, and it says if you pull one stitch, it's not a chibur. The ein ba mishum Kilayim, you're not chayav for Kilayim. V'ashon to the Shabbos potter, and if you remove it on Shabbos, you're potter. Also rasher l'tzad echad, if you made the heads of the thread on one side, chibur v'yesh ba mishum Kilayim, then it is an attachment with respect to sharpness. V'ashon to the Shabbos chayav, and if you tear it on Shabbos, you are chayav. Now we saw machlokas Rishonim how to learn pshat in the Mishnah. So just very briefly again, this is Chazara. Do Chazara if this is unclear. But the Rosh, Rabbi Shimshon, who is a classic Meforish on the Mishnah, effectively learns that sharpness and Shabbos are identical. The Rambam learns that the requirements for sharpness and the requirements for stitching for Shabbos are not identical, and we discussed why there would be a difference. For Shabbos, you need a melacha, you need a kiyum. For sharpness, any joining would be enough. You don't need miskayames. We saw that from the Taz. We saw that from other Mefarshim, etc. Now, whatever the logic of the difference is, the Rambam learns that whilst with Shabbos you need 2 stitches, as per our Mishnah on Ein Gimel Amud Aleph for Tofer, and for Shabbos you need a kesher, otherwise it's lacking kiyum, as per the Gemara on Ein Daled on the base. With respect to sharpness, you don't need these conditions, and the Rambam effectively therefore distinguishes between Shabbos and sharpness in 2 respects. Number 1, tkifa achas, 1 stitch with a knot is enough according to the Rambam, or number 2, 2 stitches even without a knot. It basically gets down to a question of how you translate this phrase tkifa achas in the Mishnah and Klaim, and how you translate also Asher L'Tzad Echad in the Mishnah and Klaim. That's questions about Shat that we dealt with when we learned the sugya of Tofer. However, the Halacha, bottom line, the Rambam learns, as we explained extensively when we learned that the chibur of Shabbos and the chibur of Shabbos are not identical. With respect to Shabbos, is enough that's any chibur. With respect to Shabbos, where there's the extra aspect that has to be a melacha, it has additional limitations and additional qualifications. Now, the question is that the Mishnah in Shabbos, after it says this din of sharpness, of tells you what you are chayav for sharpness. It then says if you remove it on Shabbos, you're chayav, meaning for the melacha of Koreah, you are chayav for removing it. Now, this is very strange, because again, the Rambam learns that you're chayav for sharpness if it doesn't fulfill the requirements of a melacha for Shabbos, i.e. 1 stitch plus a knot, or 2 stitches even without a knot. And nonetheless, the Mishnah says, Hashem top of Shabbos, if you remove it on Shabbos, you're chayav. Now, there's 2 questions in the Mishnah. The first question is, before we went into detail in the Mishnah, why did the Mishnah talk about the case of removing the stitching? Why didn't it talk about the case of making the stitching for Shabbos? And the second question is, if it does talk about removing the stitching, perhaps there's a logic. It's sort of the Mishnah as a narrative. If you sew sharpness, you're chayav, and if you remove that sharpness, even though in terms of sharpness you're potter, obviously you're just removing the sharpness. If you remove it on Shabbos, then you would be chayav also. So it's a sort of narrative of flow in the Mishnah. If you sew it, you're chayav, and then you remove it, you're potter. Adam doesn't love this answer, but it's a possible answer. Whether it's a good answer or not, you'll decide. However, we have a more basic problem over here. How can the Rambam learn Hashomta b'Shabbos chayav that you are chayav for tearing a stitch, which is a sufficient stitch with respect to sharpness? Hurry, for Shabbos you need shtei tefiras as per the Mishnah, and for sharpness it's sufficient 1 tefira with a knot. For Shabbos you need kesher shel kayama, and for sharpness it's sufficient a kesher she'ena shel kayama. So how do we resolve this contradiction? So this is a terrible problem. And I think the answer is, again, absolute evidence, like the Biur Halacha. Because the Biur Halacha told us that is not true. Koreah you are chayav for on Shabbos, even if it doesn't have the share of shtei tefiras. And therefore, quite possibly, even if it doesn't have the kiyum of kesher in order to make it niskayim. Koreah isn't identical to Tofer. One particular type of Koreah is symmetrical to Tofer. And this is Koreah almanas litzvor. And there the Mishnah adds in the condition of shtei tefiras. However, Koreah, which isn't almanas litzvor, for example, a Koreah b'chamosai or Koreah rameis, whatever its relationship to the other sort of Koreah is, we saw this Fasemes that says maybe it's a ko-av or an av and a tolda, but it's a separate Koreah. It's not a Koreah where its significance is as a means to prepare for Tofer, but it's a Koreah which has its own intrinsic significance. There, the Rambam would agree it doesn't need the share. The Halacha would agree, as per the Halacha, it doesn't need the share of shtei tefiras. And therefore, the Rambam would say this is sufficient to explain the Mishnah in Kalayim. If you sew Kalayim, you're chayav even with 1 tefira and even without a knot. If you have 2 tefiras, but not with Shabbos, that's for the melachot Tofer. If you tear almanas litzvor, it has the same dinim as per the Mishnah in Ein Gimel Amud Aleph. If you tear for some other reason, like b'chamosai, then why should I have these tanoim? Why should I have these conditions? And therefore you'd be chayav even without these conditions. So I think this is a very good reading in the Mishnah Kalayim, and another piece of evidence like the Biur Halacha. I don't know how the Minchas Chinuch would resolve this issue. And I think this gives us a deeper insight again into the Tosfos and Lamed Aleph and Beis, because this is what Tosfos' point really is. that the Mishnah lists the almanas melachos, where the almanas changes or remolds the melacha into its image. Koreah, as Koreah itself, where it's just done for its own sake, such as Koreah b'chamasai, doesn't have a shiur. But Koreah almanas litzvo, there the Mishnah lists it because in order to tell us shtei tefillos, we need shtei tefillos, and both Tosas and the Rambam seem to be reading the shtei tefillos not as a condition in your intentionality, how much do I want to resew it, shtei tefillos, but a condition in the amount I need to tear when the Koreah is done. In order to resew, I have to tear a quantity of shtei tefillos, because there it would have the same tanoim, the same conditions as tofa. If I just do a Koreah for its own sake, it wouldn't have the same conditions as tofa. So what we've seen from this is two things. We've understood the svara of the shiur of shtei tefillos, whether it's a shiur or whether it's a quality of an amount of joining. And we've also understood the relationship between Koreah and Litzvo, and understood, at least according to these two Rishonim, or at least according to the Rambam explicitly, and perhaps according to Tosfos, and certainly according to the understanding of the Biur Halacha, the Koreah, which is not Almanas Litzvo, has other conditions. Finally, I just want to remind you, again, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the Rambam that we saw about Medavek Shtei Niyaros, where the Rambam there again seemed to indicate that it wouldn't need, the Koreah there would not need the shiur of Shtei Tefillos, and again, the logic of that would be, again, as per the Biur Halacha, that you can't just extrapolate across Shtei Tefillos into every instance. So even though the Rambam says you need Shtei Tefillos as a Tzvah in Koreah, that's only in a Koreah which is Almanas Litzvo. That brings me to an end of what I wanted to say on this sugya. So I'll stop there unless there are any questions, and Emir Hashem will resume after Pasach.
Can I just ask one thing then, Rabbi Zobin? If it's not, in the case of the Mishnah in Kilayim, if it's not, though, a proper chibur, because the rules of Kilayim per the Rambam are different to the rules of Shabbat, how can the Hashamta b'Shabbat chayav, it's not even a Koreah according to that in the first place on Shabbat, if it's not a proper chibur per the rules of Shabbat?
So I don't know if that's correct, meaning this is the point. When it comes to the melacha of tofer, the chashivus is, it has to be miskayemes, has to have a degree of permanence in order to make it the melacha of tofer. But when it comes to the melacha of Koreah, if the whole significance of the Koreah is in order to rejoin, then it would have all the same conditions. If the purpose of the Koreah is for something else, because it has some other intrinsic achievement, then you need to look at what the Koreah's internal logic is. And the internal logic of Koreah is that it gives me satisfaction to tear when I'm angry, or it's a sign of mourning when I'm Koreah Hameis, and that's a different sort of achievement. There's no halacha that Koreah has to be for permanent stitching.
But it doesn't. So it doesn't have to come from the same. It doesn't have to come from the same level of tofer. Then that's the point you're saying. It can come from a lower level of tofer. That it wasn't even a tofer per Shabbat. It can come from that point. It still can be Koreah, even though you've gone from a lower base point.
That is exactly right. If it's
okay, I didn't realize that. Yeah.
If it's enough of a chibur for sharpness, who's to say it's not enough of a chibur for tearing on Shabbos?
Okay, good. Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to add, can I just add that? I was just thinking maybe the Mishnah is even more parallel than we at first learn, and it really is. Maybe you've got a beggar that is shatnez that's joined by a chibur that's good enough for shatnez, but not by anything else, and your tikkun is just removing the shatnez, and now you've got a wearable beggar.
Ah, that's interesting. Very interesting. You're saying the chashivas of this melacha is the removal of the shatnez. To make it
yeah.
That's very beautiful. I didn't think of that. Very nice. Very nice. I don't know what the halacha would be with that. The halacha of we've learnt Koreah b'chamosai and Koreah al hameis. What would happen if you Koreah in order to remove sharpness? Would that also be enough of melacha? The Koreah, yes. Yeah, the Koreah, yes. I mean, it's a very nice point, and that would gufa be the achievement itself. Very interesting, Hara. Thank you for that. I'm actually trying to find, I can't find it in front of me now, the Rambam about Medabik Niyaris. Does anyone have the source sheet in front of them? Does anyone remember? Here we are on the source sheet in Tova. Medabik Niyaris Oris Potential Sofrim. Yeah, there the Rambam doesn't mention the shiur. If you look in the Rambam in Perik Yud Halacha Yud, he says Koreah katei litva shtei tefillos, al manas litva shtei tefillos chayev. And in Halacha Yud Aleph, Perik Yud Halacha Yud Aleph, he says Hamadabik niyaris ha'oris b'koden shal sofrim m'kiyotze. How is that told us tofim chayev? And he doesn't mention the shear of shtei tefillos, which again might be indicative of the fact that Koreah doesn't have the shear if you do a different sort of Koreah. Okay, so we'll stop there. I wish everyone a good day, and for those who I don't see the rest of the time, I wish you a good Pesach, for those of you who I see more regularly, I'll delay wishing you a good Pesach till another time.
Just to mention, Rabbi Zobin, what Martin says is actually said if people's got a Mishnah Kahati, the end of the explanation of Kahati on that Mishnah references what Martin says, I believe. So about removing the Kalayim. Does
Kahati bring a source for that? I wonder if it's from.
I think he's. There's a lot. Tosfot on Shem Rabbi Guyon Maharach Berlin.
You know, if I can ask you afterwards just to take a photo of it and send me a WhatsApp picture.
Okay, I'm not very good. Sorry, I didn't realize who it was.
Okay, yeah, if you can take a photo, I'd like to see that. Thank you.
Okay,
thank you.
Okay. Wish everyone a good Pesach.
Thank you. One more question, actually. Just when we talk about the Koreah Alamet, Edward and I are wondering, why is it not mitzvah hababa avera, and essentially you've therefore not achieved anything by doing your Koreah, and therefore it stops being a tikkun?
I don't know if the concept mitzvah bavera would apply in this case. Mitzvah bavera doesn't apply in outcome-based mitzvahs always. For example, if you give tzedakah on Shabbos by handing something out from a house from a Shas Rabin to a Shas Yachid, I don't think the concept of mitzvah bavera is where the achievement is in the action itself. Actions have two forms: actions which are creating an outcome, and actions where the action has the intrinsic worth. If it's a creating an outcome type action like tzedakah, I don't think the concept of mitzvah bavera applies. But I need to think about that more.
Okay, thank you.
Shkoyach everyone, thank you very much. Have a good day.